Border Patrol agents descended on Charlotte in unmarked cars, wearing tactical gear, carrying long guns, making arrests across churches and grocery stores and school neighborhoods. No warnings, no coordination, and the fear was immediate. Families kept their children home, workers stayed inside, and parents told me that they were afraid to even open their doors. And by Monday, November 19th, by that morning, more than 30,000 Charlotte-Mecklenburg students were absent from school, nearly 1 out of every 4 students in my district. And these children didn't stay home because of a book in the library. They didn't stay home because of a curriculum dispute. They stayed home because they were terrified. And while we sit here today debating whether parents can access curriculum, something they already have the right to do, the real crisis hurting students right now is fear in our...
What you just witnessed when Representative Alma Adams stood before Congress and spoke those words was not hyperbole, but documentation of something happening right now in America that should make every single person who believes in due process and constitutional protections and basic human dignity feel something primal surge up in their chest, because more than 30,000 students, roughly 20% of those enrolled in Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools, were absent on Monday, November 7th, and this wasn't because of snow or illness or some administrative holiday. This was terror in its purest form, manufactured by the state and directed at families whose children were too afraid to walk through school doors. Think about what that means for one burning second before we move forward, because we need to understand the magnitude of what's unfolding. 30,000 children keeping their bodies inside their homes because federal agents in tactical gear descended on their communities, and we're about to unpack why this represents not just a failure of immigration policy, but a deliberate architecture of fear that has historical echoes so dark they should make us all shudder. Governor Josh Stein described agents operating in unmarked cars wearing paramilitary garb and masks, stopping people on the street randomly based on the color of their skin. And let's be absolutely clear about what's happening here, because this isn't just aggressive enforcement. This is the deliberate construction of a police-state apparatus targeting specific communities with tactics that allow ICE agents to cover their faces, arrive in unmarked cars, refuse to provide badge numbers or identify themselves, and detain someone without a warrant from a judge. We're watching the erosion of constitutional protections happen in real time, and the fact that so many Americans have become desensitized to this represents one of the most profound moral failures of our current political moment, because when you strip away the procedural language and the bureaucratic euphemisms, what you have is masked men with guns pulling people from their communities, with virtually no oversight or accountability, and somehow we're supposed to believe this is about public safety when more than 30,000 students were reported absent, and businesses shut down and families couldn't even attend church services without fear. Now here's where this gets even more devastating, and you need to stay with me, because the layers of systemic violence here are profound. Operation Charlotte's Web was led by Border Patrol Section Chief Gregory Bovino, who also was in charge of the Chicago operation, meaning we're seeing a coordinated national strategy of militarized immigration enforcement, moving from city to city like some grotesque roadshow of state violence. The city had been on high alert since last week, as reports surfaced that the operation would involve armored vehicles, and as many as 200 agents. 200 agents with armored vehicles descending on Charlotte like it's some kind of war zone, rather than a city where families live and work and raise their children. And this isn't accidental, because the spectacle of overwhelming force is the point. The trauma is the policy. The fear is the mechanism through which they hope to achieve what they grotesquely call self-deportation, which is just a sanitized way of saying we're going to make your life so unbearable that you'll leave. The constitutional violations here are staggering, and we need to be precise about this because ICE continues to violate the Constitution in the context of immigration raids where agents selectively target predominantly Latino neighborhoods and work sites, enter people's homes without proper warrants or consent, and coerce frightened individuals to submit to interrogations about their citizenship and immigration status. This isn't enforcement, this is predation, and the fact that Democratic House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries compared mask-wearing by ICE agents to secret police forces in authoritarian regimes should tell you everything you need to know about how far we've drifted from basic democratic norms. When elected officials are making comparisons to authoritarian secret police, and they're not exaggerating but rather making precise historical parallels, we have crossed into territory that should alarm every single person regardless of their position on immigration policy. But wait, because it gets worse. And I know you might be thinking, how could it possibly get worse? But let me tell you about the economic devastation this has wrought on Charlotte. A local dry cleaner that usually has more than 24 people working had only 3 because the other 23 called in and said they could not come to work. Which means we're witnessing the collapse of local economic activity because people are literally too terrified to leave their homes to go to their jobs. Manolo Betancourt, who owns Manolo's Bakery in Charlotte, decided not to open his business after he witnessed people being stopped by Border Patrol agents outside, saying he wasn't going to risk his customers because safety is more important than any money. Let that sink in for a moment. Small business owners choosing to close their doors, not because of economic factors or market conditions, but because the presence of federal agents has made it unsafe for their customers to exist in public space. And if that doesn't sound like occupation rather than law enforcement, then I don't know what would. The human stories emerging from Charlotte are absolutely devastating, and they reveal the indiscriminate nature of these raids that betrays the administration's claims about targeting violent criminals. Jonathan Ocampo, an American citizen of Colombian descent, said he doesn't leave the house without his United States passport, carrying it on his person, and he worries that his father, who is a citizen who has been in the country for 40 years, could be targeted because of being Hispanic-looking and speaking very broken English. American citizens are carrying their papers to prove their right to exist in public space. We have literally returned to a show-me-your-papers regime that should make anyone with even a passing familiarity with 20th-century European history deeply uncomfortable, and the fact that Willie Aceituno, a Honduran-born United States citizen, had his car window smashed by immigration authorities while he was getting breakfast after agents chased 2 people, demonstrates that even legal status provides no protection when enforcement is based on racial profiling and operates without meaningful constitutional constraints. Now let's talk about the Biden administration's role in all of this, because we need to be unflinching in our analysis even when it implicates Democrats. And here's the brutal truth that progressives need to reckon with. While these specific raids in Charlotte happened under what appears to be continued Trump-era policies, as immigrants in Charlotte are the latest target of the Trump administration's immigration enforcement blitz, the Biden administration spent years building and maintaining the infrastructure that makes this level of militarized enforcement possible. In the year after Title 42 ended, the Biden administration deported more people than in any year since 2010, and the Biden administration fundamentally changed its policy on border enforcement, combining strategies to use stricter enforcement and narrow access to asylum to disincentivize arrivals between official border crossings. The uncomfortable reality is that Democrats have too often capitulated to right-wing framing on immigration rather than defending the moral and legal principles at stake, and this capitulation has created the conditions under which operations like Charlotte's Web become possible. The historical parallels here are not subtle, and we need to name them explicitly because attorneys general highlighted the long history of discriminatory and militarized immigration enforcement campaigns in California, including Operation Wetback, a 1954 mass deportation campaign that took its name from an ethnic slur, describing how families were separated and many children never again saw their parents, with historians and scholars widely condemning these discriminatory raids as inhumane terror campaigns. We are watching history repeat itself, and the fact that these operations are being conducted with such brazen disregard for constitutional norms and basic human dignity tells you everything about how far the normalization of anti-immigrant sentiment has progressed in American political discourse. Representative Alma Adams called Operation Charlotte's Web a campaign of terror, writing that these disturbing tactics mirror those used during implementation of mass deportation activities in other cities, and that these actions are unacceptable and have no place in North Carolina nor anywhere else in the country. Per Payne Pace, and she is absolutely correct in her characterization, because what else do you call an operation that keeps 30,000 children home from school, out of fear? The question of who is actually being arrested in these operations completely undermines the government's justification about targeting dangerous criminals, and this is where the propaganda breaks down under scrutiny. Early data from the arrests suggest most of those detained do not have violent criminal histories, according to media reports, even as officials have said they will enforce immigration laws against anyone they encounter who is in the country illegally, regardless of criminal history. So the stated purpose about removing dangerous criminals was always a lie, always a rhetorical smokescreen for what this actually is, which is indiscriminate mass enforcement designed to terrorize entire communities. And when you couple that with the fact that reporting has highlighted allegations that American citizens are also sometimes being swept up in the raids, you start to understand that this isn't about crime prevention at all, but rather about ethnic cleansing through terror and displacement. The militarization of immigration enforcement has reached truly dystopian proportions, and we need to understand the institutional architecture that makes this possible, because since ICE was created after the 9/11 attacks, Its agents have operated with vastly more enforcement power, less transparency, and fewer guardrails than local police, with ICE's rules designed largely to give the agency broad leeway in helping the FBI identify and arrest domestic terror suspects. But now the Trump administration is using that power to go after unauthorized immigrants, potentially millions of them, with a frequency and aggressiveness that has sent ripples through communities nationwide. We built a surveillance and enforcement apparatus in the name of fighting terrorism, and now that apparatus has been turned inward on immigrant communities with devastating effect. And this is the inevitable trajectory of every authoritarian security state that the architects of this system are either too naive or too complicit to acknowledge. The coordinated use of the military to carry out a deportation agenda is unprecedented and deeply dangerous, a tactic straight out of the authoritarian playbook, and we're seeing this play out not just in Charlotte but in cities across the country. The erosion of trust between immigrant communities and local institutions is one of the most pernicious long-term effects of these operations, and Representative Adams understood this intuitively. The collaboration between local law enforcement and ICE eroded the trust between immigrant communities and law enforcement, raising the question of why would non-citizens report crimes committed against them if they thought that by doing so they could attract police officers who could ask them for proof of immigration status and potentially deport them. This is how you destroy public safety from the inside out. When entire communities can't report crimes or cooperate with investigations or access public services without fear of deportation, you haven't made anyone safer. You've just created zones of vulnerability and exploitation where bad actors know their victims won't seek help, and yet we're supposed to believe that these operations are about public safety when they systematically undermine the very foundations of community policing and trust that actual public safety depends upon. Now let's talk about Congress and the complete moral bankruptcy of our legislative priorities. Because Adams made this point with surgical precision, these children didn't stay home because of a book in the library. They didn't stay home because of a curriculum dispute. They stayed home because they were terrified. And while Congress sits debating whether parents can access curriculum, something they already have the right to do, the real crisis hurting students right now is fear in our communities. The contrast could not be more stark between the manufactured culture war nonsense about critical race theory and drag queen story hours versus the actual tangible terror being inflicted on 30,000 children who were too afraid to go to school, and the fact that Republicans want to spend endless hours concerned trolling about trans athletes while saying nothing about militarized raids that traumatize entire communities tells you everything about their actual priorities and their complete lack of genuine concern for children or families or any of the values they claim to hold dear. The impact on education cannot be overstated, and we need to understand this as a direct attack on the social fabric of these communities. Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools had over 30,000 students absent following the launch of Operation Charlotte's Web, with CMS typically seeing an average absence rate of about 7.9%, but on that Monday the number surged to more than 20%. Schools are supposed to be safe spaces where children can learn and develop and socialize, but when federal agents are conducting operations near schools and parents are terrified to let their children travel to and from educational institutions, you have fundamentally broken that social contract. Important academic activities, including after-school programming, are being disrupted as students, teachers, and school staff are being traumatized by this operation. We're not just talking about one day of absence, we're talking about sustained educational disruption that will have long-term developmental and academic consequences for an entire generation of children who are learning that their government views them as threats rather than as future citizens deserving of protection and investment. The Supreme Court has given ICE virtually unlimited power to operate as a shadow police force, and this represents one of the most significant erosions of constitutional protections in recent American history, because to conduct raids or operations targeting suspects, ICE agents only need an administrative warrant, a warrant signed by a supervisor, not a judge. Think about what this means from a separation of powers perspective. We have an executive branch agency that can authorize its own searches and seizures without judicial oversight, which is precisely the kind of general warrant that the Fourth Amendment was designed to prevent. And yet somehow this has become normalized to the point where most Americans don't even understand how radical a departure this represents from basic constitutional principles. ICE agents can conceal their identities and refuse any request to disclose their personal information, which has led to conflicts as well as allegations by Trump's administration that protesters have tried to dox agents, though officers in other agencies are required to identify themselves and provide badge numbers to prevent impersonators, and ICE has no such requirement, with reports of ICE impersonators harassing people, creating more chaos and uncertainty in some communities. So we've created a system where federal agents can operate in total anonymity, with virtually no accountability, and then act surprised when this creates conditions ripe for abuse and impersonation. Representative Adams has demanded transparency and accountability in ways that should inspire every progressive, because she's asking the questions that actually matter. Adams demanded answers to 15 questions by December 5th, including a comprehensive list of everyone arrested with their criminal histories, citizenship status, and current detention location. And she asked how many United States citizens have been arrested, how many detained individuals had no criminal convictions, and whether agents conducted enforcement actions at schools, places of worship, or healthcare facilities. These are not rhetorical questions. These are the foundational inquiries that any democratic society should demand answers to when its government conducts massive enforcement operations, and the fact that DHS has been so resistant to providing this basic information tells you that they know the answers would be politically damaging, because they would reveal the gulf between the propaganda about targeting dangerous criminals and the reality of indiscriminate enforcement targeting anyone who happens to be in the wrong place with the wrong skin color. The economic argument here is also devastating, because Adams expressed concern about the presumed excessive cost of this unnecessary operation, a cost borne by American taxpayers, despite the absence of transparent information detailing how this operation was funded, arguing that the American people deserve to know where their tax dollars were spent and why they were allocated to support a discriminatory and harmful operation rather than toward initiatives that would actually improve public safety. We're spending enormous amounts of money not on addressing root causes of migration, not on creating functional immigration courts, not on supporting communities, but on militarized operations that traumatize children and destabilize local economies, and Republicans who constantly claim to care about fiscal responsibility are silent because this spending serves their ideological agenda of cruelty, even as it accomplishes nothing in terms of actual border security or public safety. The fact that more than 425 people have been arrested during Operation Charlotte's Web might sound impressive until you realize that this represents families destroyed, communities traumatized, children separated from parents, and American citizens wrongfully detained, all in service of a political theater that does nothing to address the actual systemic issues driving migration. According to data analysis by the Cato Institute, roughly 1/5 of all FBI agents, as well as half of all DEA agents, have been reassigned to working on immigration raids, with 90% of the Department of Homeland Security investigation staff reassigned to ICE, even though those HSI agents had previously been tasked with handling human trafficking, child exploitation, cybercrime, weapons export controls, intellectual property theft, drugs and terrorism cases. So we're taking resources away from investigating actual threats to public safety, away from combating human trafficking and child exploitation and terrorism, in order to conduct raids that terrorize families and disrupt communities, and somehow we're supposed to believe this makes us safer. The targeting of churches and places of worship represents a particularly egregious violation of constitutional norms because it strikes at the heart of First Amendment protections and the historical sanctuary tradition, churches report being half empty, an after-school program canceled activities, and one United States citizen said he started carrying his passport. Houses of worship are supposed to be sanctuaries not just in the religious sense, but in the civic sense as places where people can gather without fear of state violence, and when federal agents are conducting operations near or around these spaces, you have fundamentally violated the separation between church and state, and the freedom of assembly that are supposed to be bedrock American values. The fact that attendance at religious services has plummeted because families are afraid to gather in their own faith communities tells you everything about the climate of fear that has been deliberately manufactured through these operations. We need to be absolutely clear about what's happening here from a civil liberties perspective, because when a nation militarizes its borders, it also changes its relationship to its own people, and when immigration enforcement adopts the tools and tactics of warfare, it brings that logic inward, turning neighbors into suspects and prioritizing containment over compassion, with the erosion of civil liberties rarely happening all at once. This is textbook authoritarianism, the gradual normalization of police-state tactics under the guise of security concerns, and every single person who values democratic governance and constitutional protections should be sounding the alarm, because these tactics will not remain confined to immigrant communities, but will inevitably expand to target anyone the state deems threatening. To defend civil liberties is not only to protect the rights of immigrants, but to protect the integrity of the Constitution itself, for everyone. And this is the point that too many Americans fail to understand, that you cannot have a two-tier system of constitutional protections where some people have rights and others don't, without eventually seeing those protections eroded for everyone. The comparison to historical atrocities is not hyperbole, but necessary moral clarity, and when Hakeem Jeffries said we're not behind the Iron Curtain, and this is not the 1930s, he was drawing a line in the sand and saying these are the historical parallels we must resist, because every authoritarian regime in modern history has begun with the dehumanization and persecution of minority populations, justified through appeals to security and order. The fact that we have masked agents operating without identification, conducting raids based on racial profiling with minimal judicial oversight, should set off every alarm bell for anyone who has studied how democracies die, because this is how it happens, not through dramatic coups, but through gradual erosion of norms and protections, until suddenly you wake up and realize you're living in a fundamentally different and more oppressive society than the one you thought you inhabited. Now here's what makes me absolutely furious, and you should be furious too. While all of this is happening, while 30,000 children are too terrified to go to school, while American citizens are carrying their papers to prove their right to exist, while families are being ripped apart and communities are being traumatized, Republicans in Congress want to talk about Hunter Biden's laptop and whether Joe Biden once used the word illegal to describe someone who entered the country without authorization. The moral priorities here are so inverted they would be comical if they weren't so devastating, because we have children experiencing trauma that will last their entire lives, and the response from the right is to manufacture more culture war grievances while offering no actual solutions to immigration policy and actively supporting the militarized enforcement that makes everything worse. Representative Adams represents the kind of moral courage we desperately need more of in Congress, someone willing to stand up and name what's happening as a campaign of terror, someone willing to demand accountability even when it's politically inconvenient, someone willing to center the voices and experiences of the 30,000 children who couldn't go to school, rather than the manufactured anxieties of voters who have been propagandized into fearing their neighbors. Adams described the operation as a campaign of terror, and said federal agents' actions have sparked fear across immigrant communities in the city, and this is the kind of clear-eyed moral analysis that refuses to sanitize state violence with euphemistic language about enforcement and security. The long-term consequences of these operations will reverberate for generations, because you cannot traumatize 30,000 children without creating lasting psychological and social damage that will affect everything from educational outcomes to mental health to civic participation. We're teaching an entire generation of young people that their government views them as threats, that their communities are zones of danger rather than belonging, that the color of their skin or the accent of their parents makes them targets rather than citizens deserving of protection. This is how you break the social fabric of democracy. This is how you create the conditions for cycles of marginalization and exclusion that become self-perpetuating, and the fact that we're doing this deliberately, in the name of immigration enforcement, while claiming to care about children and families, is grotesque hypocrisy of the highest order. The question before us right now is whether we're going to allow this to become the new normal, or whether we're going to resist with every tool at our disposal, because these operations in Charlotte are not an aberration, but a blueprint for what the Trump administration wants to implement nationwide. We need to support sanctuary policies, we need to demand congressional oversight and accountability, we need to document and publicize every constitutional violation, we need to provide legal support to those who have been wrongfully detained, we need to organize community defense networks, we need to make it politically impossible for this kind of terror campaign to continue. The 30,000 children who stayed home from school in Charlotte are depending on us to do something more than express outrage and move on to the next news cycle. They need us to actually dismantle the machinery of state violence that has made their lives into nightmares. This is about who we are as a country, and what values we actually hold, versus what values we merely claim to espouse. Because if we can watch 30,000 children too afraid to go to school and not feel compelled to fundamental systemic change, then we have lost something essential about our humanity and our democratic commitments. Representative Adams spoke truth to power, and now the question is whether we're going to amplify that truth and turn it into action, or whether we're going to let it get buried under the next wave of distractions and manufactured controversies. The children of Charlotte are watching. The families living in fear are watching, history is watching, and we need to decide right now what side we're on.